Welcome, and thank you everyone for joining the World Affairs Council today. We have a very special and returning guest, Dr. Stephen Cook, Senior Fellow for Middle East and Africa Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations and columnist at Foreign Policy. Thanks for joining us again, Stephen.
It's great to be with you.
Today's event is going to be a conversation between Stephen Cook and Megan Torrey, CEO of the World Affairs Council of Connecticut. Stephen Cook is the Senior Fellow for Middle East and Africa Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's an expert on Arab and Turkish politics, as well as U.S. Middle East policy. Stephen is the author of his most recent book, False Dawn: Protest, Democracy, and Violence in the New Middle East. He's also a columnist at Foreign Policy magazine. He is also widely published in international affairs journals, opinion magazines, and newspapers, and is a frequent commentator on radio and television. His latest article, Lebanon as We Know It Is Dying, was published just a few days prior to the devastating explosion in Beirut. And we are thrilled to have him today to join us to discuss this article and more. We'll add a link to that article in the chat as well, so you can check it out. And now let's get started. I'm pleased to turn over to Megan Torrey, CEO of the World Affairs Council.
Thanks, Amanda. Stephen, we're so happy to have you back. This is excellent.
Thank you.
So as Amanda said, you had this article published on July 30th about Lebanon. When you heard about the explosion, sort of what went through your mind?
Well, I can't use what I said, but I was, we were on vacation, or as much as one can vacation during a global pandemic. And my wife's phone buzzed and she said, "Oh my God, Stephen." And she read me the headline. And then I did what I normally do is I headed to Twitter, and the first thing I saw was actually a video of it. And it was really, it was extraordinary. And I just, knowing nothing about, I'm not a physics guy, but you could see from the very beginning that this was going to be an absolutely devastating thing for a country that was already suffering terribly from the combination of financial collapse and the added on problems, economic problems associated with COVID-19. So this was, I think the first thing I said to myself was, the poor Lebanese, they just do not deserve this. That was my reaction. And then I was kind of glued to Twitter for a little while. The unfortunate thing was, perhaps Turkey's leading government Twitter troll then got to it and said that I was actually CIA and that my article was a coded signal to go ahead with to agents in Lebanon to go ahead with the explosion, which was, of course, patently ridiculous. I am not CIA, I'm CFR. Not the same thing, of course. It's actually quite scary because that can motivate people to do harm to me or my family, but unfortunate.
It is absolutely important. I mean, I know we've all seen the pictures of, the first explosion and then the bigger, right, enormous explosion. And it really does sort of take your breath away, the enormity of it all.
Right.
Can you set the stage for us? Can you tell us what is happening on the ground in Lebanon today? I mean, I know right before we signed on, I got the alert that the prime minister has resigned, but sort of lay the groundwork for, what's going on.
Well, the resignation of Prime Minister Hassan Diab is obviously not an unexpected development, especially since other ministers, beginning last week with the resignation of the foreign minister, even before the explosion, and now with the explosion, a number of other ministers and the massive protests. I think what's clear was that the explosion accelerated a process that was already underway, in which this government was under tremendous pressure. Keep in mind that there have been protests ongoing in Lebanon since at least last October in response to the financial collapse of the country. And in fact, in March, Lebanon defaulted on its debt. Over this period of time between the beginning of 2019 and up until where we are today, 50% of Lebanese find themselves either in poverty or absolutely destitute. Food insecurity has become widespread. Barter has become a norm for people. There's 1 or 2 hours a day of electricity. Lebanon's economy is based on real estate, services, and transfers of Lebanese abroad, from Lebanese abroad. And as a result, Lebanon imports 80% of food, fuel, and medicines that it has. So the combination of this financial collapse, the Lebanese lira, during this period, and then COVID-19, where the Lebanese government was actually able to effect a shutdown on the economy, threw thousands upon thousands of people out of work. The Lebanese are just suffering terribly now. Of course, we have this horrible explosion. In addition to the loss of life and the number injured, it has destroyed a good part of the city, the heart of the country. And by all measures, by all evidence, this is a result of government dysfunction and negligence. And Lebanese have clearly had enough. And it has intensified protests and demands not just for the end of the government, but also demands for a change in the system. And I think that that's very important when you think about the resignation of the prime minister. That's just one step that people want. And it's one step that I think is necessary, but it's certainly not sufficient to correct what's been happening in Lebanon over many, many years.
So you've written that, unlike other states in the region, Syria, Iraq, the crisis in Lebanon is self-inflicted. Can you tell us, what the underlying factors were? Why is this crisis self-inflicted?
Yeah, and let me be clear. When I wrote that, I was referring to, Syria is racked by civil war. Libya is racked by civil war. Yemen racked by civil war. Iraq, a mistaken effort at regime change that then resulted in civil war. That's not to suggest that Lebanon in the past hasn't had to contend, obviously, with civil war and sectarian differences and so on and so forth. But the immediate cause of Lebanon's collapse has been mismanagement, dysfunction, and corruption. And it's important to recognize that the system in Lebanon, the one that is a sectarian political system or a confessional political system that basically divvies up political and thus economic power among religious sects and with some sense of ethnicity as well, breeds corruption and dysfunction because leaders of the different communities care more about servicing their communities, their religious communities, their sects, than they are thinking about the entire country. So if you think about it, a legacy of the French colonial period, the president has always been a Christian, the prime minister a Sunni Muslim, the speaker of the Chamber of Deputies of the Parliament a Shia Muslim, and then the seats in the parliament were divided evenly among Christians and Muslims, and then divided among the sects within them. And again, it created this, ostensibly the generous interpretation of it that would keep peace. What the French were really doing was building up their allies. But then, of course, this situation broke out into violence between 1975 and 1989. And there was some effort to change the system. 2005, the so-called Cedar Revolution, people paid lip service to getting beyond this sectarian system, but it never really happened. And so who's been running Lebanon is basically the warlords and leaders from the Civil War period. And they've replicated this system of sectarian spoils, which, as I said, leads to dysfunction. Now, tons and tons of Lebanese want to change this. They recognize that this is the problem, but they've been unable to do it so far. One last point, and then we can move on to the next point, is that you have this 800-pound gorilla or 1,000-pound elephant in the living room, and that's Hezbollah, which has created a state within a state. The Shia resistance movement, terrorist organization that is the most powerful, the wealthiest, has its own army. Its army is an expeditionary force around the Middle East that has held the country essentially hostage for the past almost 40 years. So Lebanon has a complex layer of problems that are going to be really hard to tackle.
Can you talk about Hezbollah a little bit more and its, its sort of role in Lebanon in how it will play a role as Lebanon tries to move forward?
Well, I think it's an important question because Lebanon is the power broker. If you go through the list of ministers in the government for which the prime minister has just resigned, you see how many of them are actually aligned with or receive support from Hezbollah, which, as I said, has become the power broker. In part because it of its force of arms. There's a mythology about resistance to Israel and so on and so forth, but that only goes so far. It has become this important political player backed up by its weaponry. Now, Hezbollah has been able to manipulate and hostage by dint of the resistance narrative, as well as the wealth and arms that it enjoys, either through Iran's patronage or other means, smuggling drugs and things like that. Is it going to willingly allow reform and change to happen that will reduce its power? I find this extremely difficult to believe, especially because we have some other evidence that efforts to bring Hezbollah to heel or even challenge Hezbollah politically have led to nothing, and have led to Hezbollah challenging the state and actually bringing arms out into the street to demonstrate to its challengers or political leaders who's in charge. I remember I was on my way to Lebanon in 2008 and had to, at the last minute, redirect directly to Damascus, which was my second stop, because of one of these, because there was a challenge to Hezbollah from Sunni and Christian factions, and Hezbollah deployed its forces throughout Beirut rather than just in its kind of well-defined areas and sphere of influence, and everybody had to back down. So this contributes to the idea that whatever is happening in Lebanon right now in terms of the resignation of the prime minister and other ministers, and obviously an interim government and early elections, Lebanon, to my mind, is headed towards failed state. It's actually already there.
So I know when the explosion happened, there was a lot of speculation, right? It was the week or just a few days before this report on the killing of Hariri was due out. Can you explain a little bit more about that situation?
Yeah, there are two narratives around there's actually three narratives around the explosion. One is that the Israelis did it. And there's been a fair number of people in Lebanon, including some responsible journalists, who insist that they've heard airplanes overhead beforehand, that people in the mountains heard and saw airplanes. Of course, there's no radar track, there's no pictures, there's no video of any of this stuff. But nevertheless, they continue to harp on this issue. And of course, President Aoun himself said that pointed to the possibility of an external actor, something that the Secretary General of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, did not dismiss either. There's really doesn't seem to be any evidence of an Israeli involvement in this. First of all, they generally operate at night. And secondly, why take the risk of killing and destroying so many people? That the material that ignited at the port had been there for so long. Why would they do it now? There's just really no evidence of it. Although Israeli warplanes violate Lebanese airspace daily, but still, there's no evidence of it. Then the other point is that there's release of this report about the killing of Rafi Hariri that sparked the Cedar Revolution in 2005. And the theory is that Hezbollah or forces connected to it, or forces connected to the assassination of Rafi Hariri, who was in conflict with Syria, detonated this material in order to basically change the subject. There's really no evidence of that either. Sometimes the most obvious explanation is the explanation, and that is government dysfunction and negligence lead to accidents that lead to pain and suffering. I'm open to these other theories, but I need somebody to give me some evidence of it rather than just conjecture.
Right. And so we actually have an audience question. So Scott wants to know who owned the ammonium nitrate that was the cause of the huge explosion.
Well, that is actually a source of some controversy. The story goes that it was material that was sold to not the Lebanese and not even the Syrians, but a Russian-owned freighter ended up in the Syrian port with problems. And the ship was eventually abandoned by its crew and owners, leaving this material on this ship in the port. It was then subsequently transferred to these storehouses in Lebanon. And reports coming out of Lebanon is that Lebanese port officials, of which there are many and many different factions, had asked a number of times over the course of the last 6 years, what do we do with this stuff? What are we going to do with it? And never really got an answer. And so the stuff was left to sit there. That's one report. The other reporting has been that Hezbollah knew exactly what this stuff was. It was there. It's believable. Of course, Hezbollah has transships, all kinds of weaponry. But this is ammonium nitrate. Hezbollah has much more sophisticated explosives and weapons than your basic component of fertilizer and kind of crude weaponry. So again, like any kind of theory, there's pieces of it that make sense, but there's no evidence yet of Hezbollah's ownership of it. Of course, Hassan Nasrallah did Hezbollah no favors by saying, "Oh, we don't know anything about the port. We don't know anything about the airport or the port. We know more about the port in Haifa than we do which is, of course, patently ridiculous."
Right. So let's talk for a minute about other international actors. And we know that I think it was Thursday, French President Emmanuel Macron visited Beirut, and in and of itself was controversial, right? So some saying, France wants to take us over. Some saying, let's have France take us over, right? And then we know that Macron is organizing a international donors conference, but vowing to make sure that money gets into the right hands. Can we talk a little bit about that role?
That was an extraordinary visit by Emmanuel Macron. Especially because so many people came out to greet him and say, "We need your help. Ignore the government. We want your help. Ignore the government. Please, please, please help us." I keep waiting for the 1,500, 2,000 word piece that someone's going to write saying Lebanon needs a new French mandate, which I'm sure someone is going to write this at some point, which is some counterintuitive take. But and Macron did organize a donors conference, which raised the paltry sum of $300 million. I mean, Lebanon needs at least $15 billion, and the international community can come up with $300 million. Part of that is that these donor conferences never really raised too much money to begin with, and part of it is the very real concern that Macron articulated and others have articulated, is that they don't want to give the money to a corrupt government, and that they don't know what's going to happen with the assistance that they hand over. A broader concern, a concern that I have, something that I'm going to hopefully be writing about in my next column, is that you have Macron show up, then you had the Turkish foreign minister and vice president show up, then you have an announcement from the United Arab Emirates saying that it's going to rebuild the port, then you have the Russians expressing interest in rebuilding a port, and then you have the Chinese who've quietly been in Tripoli, Lebanon's second city, and who before the explosion had been saying to the Lebanese government, "We'll help you fix your economic problems," which of course was going to create a problem for Lebanon's relations with the West, and the IMF, given the state of Sino-American relations and how influential the United States is at the IMF. So here's my concern. Lebanon is a failed state. The Turks are rivals of the Emiratis. The Russians are wanting to expand their influence around the region, as are the Chinese. The French are at odds with the Turks over Libya. The Emiratis are at odds with the Turks over Libya and a variety of other issues. Is there going to be a new proxy conflict being played out in Lebanon on top of the one that's already been played out for all these years between Israel and Iran? I find it hard to believe in this context where you have a failed state that that's not going to happen. So add to this more suffering for the Lebanese people.
Can you, we have a question from the audience about Turkey. Can you expand a little bit more on, Turkey is expanding its influence, in the region. How do you think, what role do you think Turkey will play sort of as in Lebanon in the future?
Well, it's an old story with some new issues. The Justice and Development Party, which came to power in Turkey in 2002, became, much more active in the Middle East than predecessor governments in Turkish governments, although the Turkish government had from time to time been involved in the Middle East in important ways. But that President Erdogan sees Turkey and sees himself as a leader of the Muslim world. More recently, the Turks have been pursuing a more militarized foreign policy, whether it's in Syria or in Libya or in the Aegean and the Eastern Mediterranean. This is based on this doctrine that has emerged recently in Turkey called Blue Homeland, which is the brainchild of a number of senior ranking, retired, and currently serving naval officers, which says, the Mediterranean really should be a Turkish lake. And we should pursue our interests as we see fit. in this Turkish lake. And so with the Turks showing up in Lebanon, and the Turks have been involved in Lebanon after the 2006 war, Turkey dispatched troops to be part of a peacekeeping force there, et cetera, et cetera. The Turks are, again, seeming to up the ante in the Eastern Mediterranean by saying, we're going to help Lebanon build a port. It's born both of geostrategy as well as something that the Justice and Development Party, being a party, an Islamist party or party of Islamist roots, there's a kind of sense of Muslim solidarity. But of course, Lebanon is not 100%, it's not a Muslim, it's not like Turkey, which is 98% Muslim. There are others in Lebanon, and people, there are people alive in Lebanon today who have bad memories, even today, of the Ottoman period. So there are Armenians, there are Arabs whose grandparents or great-grandparents disappeared during World War I. So the Turks, who have the Justice and Development Party that's like kind of a sanitized version of Ottoman history, maybe stepping into something that they don't really quite understand.
So looking at Lebanon today with the resignation of the prime minister, the dissolution of the government, do you think that real change can happen? Is this an opportunity to create change in Lebanon? And do you foresee maybe Hezbollah playing maybe a more legitimized role in the country?
Megan, change is hard. And it's going to be even harder given all the challenges that Lebanon faces. So, Hassan Diab has now resigned. The government is no longer. There'll be some sort of interim government that is going to be expected to organize elections. The question is, to my mind, and what I think should be at everybody's mind is, what is it that some interim government that's going to organize elections or some successor government that is elected, what is it going to do to undertake that fundamental change? That it's not reform. It's basically an overthrow of the political system and the social order that supported it. And all of these politicians have benefited from it, including Hezbollah. So that then continues to put society at loggerheads with political leaders. Will some new leaders emerge? Hopefully. Will they have the best interests of Lebanon at heart? Hopefully. But then in this environment of collapse, where people who want to get beyond the sectarian system may actually seek support and aid from leaders in these confessional communities, it may harden those divisions. So yes, it's good this government is going. This government had no legitimacy to begin with. But what comes next is going to be extraordinarily difficult for any government to achieve. What Lebanon really needs is a revolution. Revolutions are rare, and when they exist, it's rare that they succeed. So I'm naturally pessimistic about things. Count me in that category for Lebanon as well.
So one actor we haven't spoken about yet at all is the United States, right? So we talked about how France, given their colonial sort of ties to Lebanon, Macron was there. Do you see the sort of role that France is playing as an abdication of the U.S. and its role in the region? Why isn't the U.S. being mentioned in this conversation?
Well, to be fair, the president did participate in the donor conference on Sunday. The United States has offered, I think, $17 million. It's hard to blame anybody because, handing money over to the Lebanese government is like throwing it away. And I think any administration would probably want the French as the former colonial power to be taking that lead. And we have some bad experiences in Lebanon. I'm not sure that Lebanon itself demonstrates an abdication of American leadership in the region. I think that generally, though, there is in the world in which I exist, and I think in the kind of genetics of the Trump administration's foreign policy, because the president himself has articulated it, and the genetics of the Trump administration's foreign policy is the president himself. There is no foreign policy process these days in Washington. It is to avoid getting the United States involved in local issues in which it could get entangled and sap its power. And I think, if you look at Lebanon, Hezbollah is a problem, Iranian influence there is a problem, but it's probably not worth the time and effort given the likelihood of failure there. And the Israelis who are concerned there really know how to handle themselves. So, there's a lot to talk about when it comes to the Trump administration's foreign policy. I think they're taking one step removed from this is not necessarily a bad thing. One of the debates going on in Washington right now is that the Pentagon has an ongoing relationship with the Lebanese armed forces. Should that continue? Is something that was being debated well before the explosion last week.
That's interesting. So we're almost out of time, but I want to ask you, is there anything that gives you hope in this moment? Anything, is there something, can we be hopeful at all about the future of Lebanon?
Yeah, I've been talking to Lebanese friends, both in and outside of Lebanon. And if you look at what people are doing, Lebanese are resilient and they're extraordinary. And so they don't deserve the government they've had. They don't deserve the system that they've had. And so it's entirely possible that the Lebanese will themselves rise to this occasion and take care of themselves. They have a lot of obstacles and a lot of forces arrayed against them. But I think Lebanese people themselves are a cause to be hopeful. That's the only one that I have.
Stephen, thank you so much for joining us again. It's always a pleasure, and I hope we get the opportunity to talk to you again soon.
Well, the Middle East is not for lacking of dramatic events and problems. So, and I'm at home. So you know where to find me.
Awesome.
And I'll just echo Megan. Thank you so much, Stephen. And thank you to
Megan.
everyone who's joining us out there. Like any more information, you can visit our website at ctwac.org. So most of all, thank you again. We hope to see you again soon. And thank you so much, Stephen, for joining us today and for a great conversation.
Thanks everyone. I hope you get your power back. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.